Across the Fence, we host an in-depth discussion of what University of Vermont Extension is doing to prepare farmers for the Food Safety Modernization Act. We'll look at who's affected by the act and its potential impacts on consumers. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. A new federal food safety law will soon be implemented, requiring many fruit and vegetable growers to adopt practices aimed at preventing foodborne illness. The Food Modernization Act, Fisma for short, is the first food safety law specifically aimed at fresh produce farmers. Some farmers believe the new law will be a game changer for their business, and since we all eat fruits and vegetables, this law will also affect consumers. Joining me is Vern Grubinger, UVM Extension's vegetable and berry specialist. Vern is also coordinator of the Northeast SARE, the USDA's Sustainable Agriculture and Research Education Program. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, what are some of the practices that Fisma will require farmers to follow?
Well, first I should say FSMA right now is a draft set of rules, so it hasn't been fully approved and implemented, but the things that are contained in those rules include much more restricted use of animal manure and compost, a lot of training of personnel, a lot more record keeping and traceability requirements so growers can find out where their produce has gone if need be.
Well, how much risk is there in eating fresh produce?
The risks are incredibly low. We hear about these major outbreaks and they're horrible and people do get sick and die, but when you think of the billions of pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables that are consumed, it's really a rarity when something bad happens. That said, the whole point of FSMA is to take a small risk and make it smaller, and I think growers are on board with that if they're asked to do reasonable things.
And so how have farmers been preparing for this?
Well, we've had a lot of interest in food safety, over the past decade or more, in part because there were voluntary programs, things like GAPS, Good Agricultural Practices, that were required by certain supermarket chains. So they were voluntary if you wanted to sell to those supermarkets. It wasn't, They weren't laws. And those ideas have, filtered throughout the growing community of increased sanitation. And there's also the organic standards where, there have been requirements to wait after applying raw manure until harvest, 3 or 4 months. So there's been a growing awareness and an increased adoption of practices. So this is sort of continuing that pattern.
But some of the ideas in the draft, though, really pertain to farmers on large farms as opposed to smaller farms that we would find here in Vermont.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest concerns that farmers and people in Extension have is it's not exactly a one-size-fits-all, but it's pretty close in some ways. And although smaller farms will be exempted from the rule, that's not exactly clear either, exactly who's out, and the marketplace will change.
What's small?
But I think this is sort of one of the take-home messages. The really big risks are posed by the very large farms and the large aggregators where you're taking food. The whole spinach outbreak of several years back was aggregated material from dozens of farms. If there's one source of contamination and now that product is going out to many, many states and hundreds of supermarkets and stuff, you've elevated the level of risk compared to an individual farm selling in their community where people know them, and if something happens, it's quite contained.
And so tell me a little bit about what you've been doing as far as an education. I mean, you've been doing a study. And what are some of the findings of your study? What is it all about, and what have you been finding?
Well, it's not just me. We've had other people in Extension involved, Ginger Nickerson and Lynn Blevins with the Center for Sustainable Ag. So, there are a number of strategies. One is just to raise understanding of, well, what are the sources of risk for farmers? So they are doing a better job of, telling their employees to wash their hands. And it's not just employees. When people go to pick your own, say you have an animal petting zoo, you would certainly want a place for people to wash their hands before they go touch food. And my colleagues have been doing what we call practical food safety workshops, where farmers write their own plans after hearing about the sources of risk, and they look at their own farms and figure out, what could I do to reduce the level of risk? But the last 2 years we had a scientific on-farm study where we sampled wash water for leafy greens to look at ways to reduce E. coli in that wash water. Leafy greens are a particular concern because they're not cooked typically. So, anytime you have a cooking activity. It's a kill stage for a lot of these pathogens. They're eaten raw, they're low to the ground, and they get put into water and swirled around, so you could get cross-contamination. Again, if one little batch had, you know, something on it, it could get mixed. So we looked at the levels, found they were sort of all over the board, and we were looking at ways to reduce the E. coli in that wash water.
So can you give me an example of what's been changed since then as far as
Well, one thing we found that was really dramatic is just multiple rinsing of that produce, you know, reduces the levels dramatically. I mean, you can have 10 times reduction with each rinse that you go through. So triple rinsing is a really effective and affordable way to reduce E. coli. Now, I should say most of the E. coli is not dangerous. It's just an indicator that there could be a dangerous type. We all have E. coli in our guts. It's a part of our digestive tract, but it is, you know, an indication that there's been animal waste present, so we don't want that. So the triple rinsing essentially takes away almost all the E. coli. And then we were looking at sanitizers. A lot of our growers in Vermont are organic, and they're not allowed to use chlorine at the levels that would be effective. Chlorine is kind of a standard practice for larger conventional farms. So there's some other materials that are basically, you know, vinegar and hydrogen peroxide is their chemistry, and we found that those are really effective too. And so the combination is the other thing we looked at, where you have multiple rinses, and in one of them you use this material that reduces the E. coli further, and we really end up with, you know, zero almost all the time, or pretty darn close.
And so that's a pretty simple fix.
Exactly. And for me, what, you know, is exciting is a lot of the things Fisma talks about, testing irrigation water, which could be months ahead of harvest, and avoiding, you know, waiting 9 months for application of manure, which in Vermont's a little strange. We have dairy farms, we have vegetable farms. It was a good agronomic practice to make use of that. You know, it shouldn't be raw right near the product, but the standard has been, you know, 4 months.
Right.
Fisma is talking about pushing up to 9. You know, my feeling was, wow, if there is some contamination from that, it's really important to be cleaning things up at the end right before you're selling them. So washing that product, sanitizing it, putting it out, that seems like a greater bang for the buck as far as things we're asking growers to do than to be so far upstream from the actual sale of the product.
And some of these things would be very costly for farmers too.
Yes, well, you know, I happen to bring one of the water test kits that we've been using, working with the Vermont Department of Health. So the test for the generic E. coli is $15, but then you have to pay somebody to go out to take those samples, to, you know, get them to the post office. They have to get there within 30 hours to put the postage on. So Fisma right now is talking about weekly testing being required of every surface water source that's used to come in contact with the edible portion of the crop. So that can add up to thousands of dollars a year on some farms.
Yeah, not to mention time out from other things that farmers want to be doing on the farm.
Right, right. And then the other issue, of course, is they've set a standard for what's allowable, which is pretty close to what is the recreational water standard for E. coli, what you could swim in.
Right.
And so there's some questionable, what if you're slightly over that number and you can't irrigate your crops and it isn't raining?
Right.
You know, that's a big economic consequence too.
Well, a video about the findings of the study that we were talking about is available on the UVM Extension website. We'll put a link up for you a little bit later. Let's hear from a farmer who participated in that study.
My name is Andy Jones. I manage Intervale Community Farm in Burlington, Vermont. We do 25 acres of certified organic produce. I'm also the current president of the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association. Over the last several years, we've worked closely with Extension to figure out practical, easily adoptable food safety strategies. One of the things that's really worked for us that we think has made a big difference is a triple rinse program for our leafy greens. We've been using it for all of our baby salad mixes and a number of other leafy greens. It's really been easy for us to adopt. It's a little bit more time on the post-harvest processing with the 3 tubs and moving things from one tub to the next. But the upside of it is it's really extended the shelf life and the product quality for us as well. So it's been kind of a win-win all around.
Well, if you're just joining us, I'm visiting with UVM Extension Vern Grubinder about the Food Safety Modernization Act, the impact it will have on farmers and also consumers. And I think that was an interesting point that you wanted to make too, is consumers have a hand in this as well.
Absolutely. I mean, food safety really is from field to plate, and farmers have to do their part to reduce risk, but you know, a lot of bad things can happen in the kitchen. And so washing is important when you're bringing home fresh produce, and storage is also important because microbes thrive at higher temperatures than cooler temperatures, so keeping things refrigerated is another step. But thorough washing is probably the most important thing in my mind that consumers can do to reduce risk.
And what else has UVM Extension been doing to help produce growers deal with the food safety risk?
Well, we're continuing to do these on-farm studies, and the practical food safety workshops are actually going on this time of year all around the state. And we're going to look into actually helping growers with a self-accreditation system. So this is not a done deal, but one of the concerns with Fisma is the smaller farms that are under the threshold for having to comply will be exempt, but that sort of leaves them in limbo in the marketplace. They won't be able to say, oh, we're complying with the law. They would like to be able to tell their buyers something, so they might have their own plan, but that's not as strong as if we had a system where we said, here's a template. If people follow this, it's something that the agencies of the state say is a reasonably rigorous practice. And so this is just at the beginning of thinking how that will all work out. But I think because so many of our farms are small and will be exempt from Fisma, it's going to be pretty important as the marketplace gets used to supermarket type growers following this law, that everybody's going to have a way to say, yes, I've stepped up to the plate and sort of done my due diligence to reduce risk.
And we should mention, too, this is something that farmers very much are interested in doing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the point is they want to do something within reason. To, try and get to zero risk is incredibly expensive. They would like to take a small risk, make it lower, do the sanitation things. I think, traceability is something else that people will get on board with, of that when it leaves your farm, it's going to have your name on it and the date it was packed, and if something happens, they'll be able to trace it back to a farm. And employee training, people are into that too. But part of the problem with Fisma is it seems to set a pretty high bar to have an official trainer on your staff and having everybody go through training every time they come in. On vegetable farms, there's a lot of part-time help. They come, they do some work for a very short period of time. So there could be a much more rudimentary posting of information. They have to read it. Basically talks about washing your hands, not harvesting anything that looks soiled and things like that. So those things will get worked out over time. I think in a scalable way that they'll be a good fit for the small farms, something they can do. And the larger farms will have to come to grips with complying with Fisma.
And so how do you think this is going to affect, or do you think it's going to affect the very strong farm-to-plate movement in Vermont and everyone wanting to get their food locally?
I actually think it's going to be a positive thing because the whole idea of having a relationship with your producer and that they have the ultimate accountability. You know who they are, you know where they are. I mean, if they sell something that's not right, that is not good for their business. They've got a lot at stake and they want to maintain those relationships. So I think there's a confidence that comes from a local and regional food system that gets lost in the more anonymous commodity system. Hey, there's stuff on the shelf. It's, they might tell you it's from California or Mexico, but you don't know the farmer and their practices, and so I think this could help local, actually.
And so what's been the reaction from farmers who have been taking part in the study and also who maybe want to take part in the study or have been doing some of the workshops?
I think farmers are enthusiastic about practical things that can reduce risk. We, promoting using these water test kits, again, $15 if you don't require constant testing, and people test just enough to make sure their systems are safe. That's something people are willing to do. It's the concern about how heavy-handed Fisma will be for them that has people more uneasy.
Is there any timeline for when that's going to be set in stone?
Well, a part of the draft rules are getting reviewed, so we're going to hear back about this timing of when manure and compost can be used and things about like the water testing. And then I believe that'll get finalized later this year, and then there's a whole staggered implementation for depending on the size of the business. So we're still, several years away from the rubber actually meeting the road and Fisma being implemented. But once it happens, it's something that we're going to have to live with.
And so, but in the meantime, farmers are
in the meantime,
just
we're
taking
preparing,
steps.
and I think part of the strategy is to get ahead of the curve, and especially for the smaller farmers to be able to say, hey, we have a system in place. It's credible. It's effective. We don't need a lot of extra regulation. Let us just do it in this practical way that is affordable.
And you've got your own system in place.
Right, and there is some oversight. It's you're not just making it up. It's been developed and reviewed by people with knowledge in food safety, and they think it's effective.
Alrighty. Well, to see that video about managing wash water, please visit uvm.edu/VT Veg and Berry. For more specific concerns or questions, you can email Vern. His email address is posted on the screen. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.